Week 11 of the fantasy football season. So with the trade deadline coming up in many fantasy leagues in the next week or two, here's a few players I look to buy and trade for this week. The first guy, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, it's been a solid first season, I say, for him with the Chicago Bear team. I know the last few weeks the numbers really haven't been great with Tyson Beckett at quarterback, but he's still scoring anywhere from 10 to 13 fantasy points for the most part is DJ Moore. So right now with Justin Fields possibly returning as early here as week 11 at the Detroit Lions, I think he could go out there and have a good game. This Lions secondary isn't all that great. We just saw them win a 41-38 shootout where both teams went up and down the field versus the Los Angeles Chargers in Los Angeles in week 10. And right now, DJ Moore, well, his numbers have been down, but like I said, he could bounce back and have a good ball game. This is a perfect time to buy him low because we know what he's capable of this season. We saw the monster 230-yard and 3-touchdown game where he had over 50 fantasy points, and we've seen a lot of 19 to 25 range fantasy point games as well. So right now with Justin Fields possibly being in the lineup this week or the week after, he's definitely a buy low candidate with the numbers dropping the last few weeks. The next play is Tony Pollard of the Dallas Cowboys. So Tony Pollard, he was a first-round, second-round pick in most fantasy drafts, and he's definitely been a bust this season is Pollard. From week 1 to week 5, his fantasy points dropped down each week. Then week 6, he had a little bust through in that one with 17 PPR fantasy points. And now the last 3 weeks, we really haven't seen much from Tony Pollard. But if this Cowboy team, they want to take the next step and make a deep playoff run, you're still going to have to run the football effectively. And I think they're going to find ways to get Pollard the football in space and receiving the football. So right now, like I said, where his numbers have been way down weeks of the season, especially, is Tony Pollard. He's a perfect buy low candidate because right now week 11 is a good matchup for him at the Carolina Panthers, where they give up the second most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So if he has a monster game, obviously the value goes back up. So right now, well, he hasn't done much and he has a good schedule coming up the next few weeks. Here's Tony Pollard. He's a perfect buy low player this week. The next play is T. Higgins, Cincinnati Bengals. So once again, another injury it's been for T. Higgins, missing last week's game versus the Houston Texans with a hamstring, and he's questionable, no doubt about it, for Thursday's game versus. And he's questionable as well. Here's T. Higgins at the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday Night Football. So right now, T. Higgins, it's a contract season. We know he's had a lot of struggles this year, even though week 8 and week 9 he started to get things going before the hamstring. He was dealing with a rib injury early in the year, but we know he's one of the better number 2 wide receivers in the league. And to have one-on-one coverage, obviously, to be with a receiver like Jamar Chase, who's getting that double coverage and getting a lot of attention, being one of the best receivers in the league. T. Higgins, like I said, he could beat that one-on-one coverage. Him and Joe Burrow have had a good rapport over the last few seasons, and health has just been the only issue for T. Higgins. If he could get healthy and get back on the field and start playing, he could pay big dividends for fantasy owners. So right now, well, he's been idle over the last week, and possibly he's going to miss this week's game as well here at the Ravens on Thursday night. He's a perfect buy low candidate, and he can help you in a big way in the stretch run before the playoffs for fantasy owners. The next play is James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals injured reserve after missing 4 games, obviously, with his injury. So this Arizona Cardinal team, I know it's been a bad year for them 2-8, but they got the first win with Kyler Murray back in the lineup in Week 10 versus Atlanta. Tough matchup, no doubt about it. Week 11 at Houston, where it could be a game where they're trailing early and often, and they just have to pass the ball and abandon the run. But James Conner, as long as he's been healthy over the last few seasons, he's a solid number 2 running back for fantasy owners. And it was a decent ball game in his return in Week 10 versus Atlanta. 16 carries, 73 yards, but I don't think you really have to give up much to get Conner on your team, and you could just plug him in as a solid number 2 running back the rest of the way. So right now, while he's coming off injury and his Week 10 return performance wasn't eye-popping, it's a perfect time, in my opinion, to go out there and buy Conner this week. The next play is Breeland Hall of the New York Jets. So Breeland Hall, we know, is an explosive running back, has top 5 running back potential in fantasy football, and he got onto a little bit of a hot streak from week 5 to week 8 with Breeland Hall, but the last 2 weeks the numbers have dropped down. Week 9 versus the Chargers, 16 carries, 50 yards, 4 catches, 10 yards. And week 10 at the Vegas Raiders, 13 carries, 28 yards, 3 catches, 47 yards. So this Jet offense is historically bad with Zach Wilson behind center, not moving the football well. This Jet team, they haven't scored a touchdown offensively in 39 drives, which is just hard to believe. Sometimes you just run into touchdowns, especially in garbage time. But that just hasn't been the case. And right now they are feeding Breeland Hall and force feeding him because he's their second best playmaker on the team behind Garrett Wilson, with this Jet team. So right now, I know tougher matchups coming up. Buffalo in Buffalo week 11, and then week 12 Miami. But right now, Breeland Hall, he's the engine to this offense, and when he's had some big games, the Jets did win 3 in a row where he had 20 or more fantasy points in all that matchup. So right now, I think they're going to get Breeland Hall the ball in space a little bit more on screens and short passes, and obviously keep force feeding him in between the tackles. So right now, we have to come in 2 mediocre games compared to what Hall's really capable of. This is a perfect time to buy Hall this week. Next play is Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. So Derrick Henry, it's been an up and down season. I know he's on an offense that isn't all that great and behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league. And we also know he's a running back that has a lot of miles now, is Derrick Henry. And once you hit that 29, 30-year-old mark, you definitely lose it. But Derrick Henry, for the most part this season, he's been a solid fantasy play. He's only had 3 bad games. And coming off a game at Tampa Bay where he only had 3 fantasy points, where they had to abandon the run, only 11 carries, 24 yards. I think he gets back on track with a familiar foe in Week 11 at the Jacksonville Jaguars. And we know running back's been a thin position this season with injuries and a lot of busts and guys not performing. So right now, while Henry has had one of the worst games he's had all season here, this is a perfect time to buy him low because the next few weeks, I like the schedule for him at Jacksonville, Carolina, Indianapolis, all teams that are bad versus the run, and teams where Henry's had great history versus, especially Jacksonville and Indianapolis. So after this bad game, I think fantasy owners could go out there and make a deal for Henry. And the final play I look to buy and trade for this week is Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Johnson, he's been back the last few weeks here after he was on injured reserve, and he had solid ball games with 12 or more fantasy points in PPR weeks from week 7 to week 9. But week 10, it was a game where nothing was going on versus Green Bay. 1 catch, 17 yards. I know week 11, a tough matchup with the Cleveland Browns. They give up the second least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But Deontay Johnson, one of the best route runners in the game, one of the better possession wide receivers in the game as well. And him and Kenny Pickett, for the most part, have a good rapport. So right now, after he had a bad game, just a fluky type of ball game, I think he could bounce back even in a tougher matchup. And this is a perfect time to buy him this week. So that's a few plays I look to buy and trade for in Week 11 of the fantasy football season.